Officer Mark Callahan had been a cop in Pine Brook, Georgia, for over 15 years. The job hardened him. He'd learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts told him certain people were more likely to cause trouble. He didn't consider himself racist, just cautious. If someone asked, he'd say he was just enforcing the law. Then came the night that changed everything. It started like any other shift. Mark was parked near a rundown gas station, sipping bitter coffee, when a black sedan rolled by. It was an older model, slightly dented, tinted windows, out-of-state plates. And, most importantly, the driver was black. A woman. Alone. Mark pulled out behind her, flashing his lights. The car hesitated for a moment before easing to the side of the road. He placed a hand on his holster and approached the vehicle. The driver rolled down her window. She was young, mid-30s, maybe, well-dressed but tired-looking. "Good evening, officer," she said, her voice steady. "License and registration." Mark replied, not bothering with pleasantries. She handed them over without a word. Her name was Olivia Carter. The address on her ID was from Chicago. He glanced at her face, high cheekbones, deep brown eyes, and an expression that was unreadable. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" "No, officer," she said calmly. "Your brake light is out," he lied. It wasn't, but she didn't argue. She simply nodded. "I wasn't aware of that. I'll get it fixed." Mark studied her. No attitude, no aggression. Still, something about her put him on edge. He wasn't sure why, but he wanted to dig. "Where are you headed?" "My grandmother's house, just outside of town. Visiting." She hesitated for a second too long. "Yes." Mark tapped her license against his palm. He could feel her watching him, waiting. It made him uncomfortable. "You mind if I take a look inside the car?" he asked, tilting his head. She raised an eyebrow. "Do you have probable cause?" Mark smirked. "Just asking." "I'd rather not," she said, voice still calm. He clenched his jaw. That was enough for him. "Step out of the vehicle." She inhaled slowly but obeyed. He patted her down. Nothing. Then he moved the car. He wasn't expecting to find much. Maybe a joint, an empty bottle, something. But when he opened the glove compartment, he found something far worse. A police badge. Mark froze. The badge was old, the leather worn. Beneath it was a photograph, black and white, slightly crumpled. A man in uniform, black, standing next to a squad car from the 1970s. Mark's stomach tightened. He knew that badge design. It belonged to Pine Brook PD. He turned to Olivia, who was watching him with something between exhaustion and defiance. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "It belonged to my grandfather," she said simply. Mark frowned. "Your grandfather was a cop?" "Yes. Here. A long time ago." He looked at the photo again. The man in it was young, proud. The last name on the badge read, Carter. Mark's blood went cold. He had heard of Officer Carter. Every cop in Pine Brook had. "You're his granddaughter?" "Yes." Officer James Carter had been the department's first black police officer. He'd been murdered on duty in 1978. The official story was that he'd been ambushed during a robbery, but there were always rumors, whispers about fellow officers who'd wanted him gone. Mark swallowed. "You don't believe he was killed by a robber, do you?" Olivia asked. Mark didn't answer. Mark took a step back. He could let her go, pretend this never happened. But something inside him twisted. He had spent years enforcing laws he barely questioned. But now, staring at that old badge, he felt something unfamiliar. Guilt. He cleared his throat. "Why are you here, really?" Olivia's face darkened. "To find out who killed my grandfather." Mark exhaled sharply. "That was 40 years ago. And yet his killers walked free," she said. "You know something, don't you?" Mark wanted to deny it. He wanted to tell her to drive away and leave the past buried. But he couldn't, because deep down he did know something. As a rookie, he'd heard stories. Stories about cops who didn't like Officer Carter, about how they set him up, sent him to that robbery alone, how the Rayall killers had never been caught because no one ever looked. Mark had never questioned it. Until now, He looked at Olivia. She wasn't just here for closure. She was here for justice. And for the first time in his career, Mark Callahan had to decide which side of the law he was really on. Mark leaned against the car, rubbing his jaw. You're risking a lot by digging into this. I don't have a choice, Olivia said. Mark sighed. He could still walk away. Ignore her. But for once, he wanted to do the right thing. You start asking questions. People are going to notice, he warned. Then help me, Olivia said. Mark looked at the badge in his hands. Then he looked at her. And against everything he thought he believed, he made his choice. All right, he said. Let's find out the truth. Mark Callahan didn't believe in ghosts. But as he stood in his kitchen that night, staring at the old police badge on his counter, he felt haunted. He had spent his whole career avoiding stories like this, ugly truths buried under the weight of how things worked. But Olivia Carter had cracked something open inside him. He grabbed a beer, took a long swig, and reached for his phone. He knew who to call. Callahan, a gruff voice answered. Sarge, Mark said, I need to ask you something about the Carter case. A long pause. Why the hell are you digging that up? Mark hesitated. He could lie, but what was the point? His granddaughter's in town, he said. She thinks his murder wasn't random. Another pause. You don't want to do this, son. The line went dead. Mark exhaled. That was answer enough. The next morning, Olivia was waiting outside the police station when Mark pulled up. You ready for this? He asked. Are you? She shot back. They went inside. Mark had access to the old case files, though he knew some things wouldn't be there. As expected, the official report was clean. Officer Carter had been called to a robbery in progress at a convenience store. No backup. Shot 3 times. The suspect, a known gang member, was later found dead in a supposed shootout with police. Case closed. Mark frowned. This is too neat. Olivia leaned over his shoulder. Look at the responding officers. Mark scanned the names. 2 stood out. Officers Reed and Holloway. Both had retired years ago. They were his partners, Olivia said. He trusted them. Mark clenched his jaw. Let's pay them a visit, Olivia said. Reed's house was an hour away. Mark knocked. The door opened a crack, revealing an old man with wary eyes. Reed, it's Callahan. Need to talk. Reed studied him, then Olivia, then sighed. I was wondering when this day would come. Inside, the house smelled like whiskey and regret. Reed sat heavily in a chair. I won't lie to you, he said, but I won't save you either. What happened? Olivia asked. Reed rubbed his face. James Carter wasn't killed by no robber. He was set up. Olivia tensed. Mark swallowed. By who? Reed looked at Mark. Your department. Silence. They sent him to that robbery knowing he'd get ambushed, Reed said. Then they made sure the guy who could have told the truth didn't live to talk. Olivia's voice shook. Why? Reed sighed. Because Carter was good. Too good. And some folks didn't like a black officer showing them up. Mark felt sick. You have proof? Olivia asked. Reed hesitated. Check Holloway's old storage unit. He kept records. Mark nodded. Where is it? Reed gave them an address. Then, before they left, he grabbed Mark's wrist. You start this. You better be ready to finish it, he warned. The storage unit was dusty and cold. They pried open an old metal box. Inside were files, photos, evidence. It was all there. The real police reports. Witness statements that had been ignored. Even a memo from the chief at the time, saying Carter was a problem that needed solving. Mark's stomach turned. Olivia was shaking. They killed him, and they got away with it. Mark clenched his fists. Not anymore. The next morning, Mark walked into the police station and dropped the files on the captain's desk. You better explain this, the captain said, eyes narrowing. Mark met his gaze. No explanation needed. The truth is right there. The captain's expression darkened. You don't want to do this, Callahan. Yeah, Mark said. I do. By nightfall, the case was reopened. News spread. The department was in chaos. and Olivia Carter stood outside the station, staring at the town that had stolen her grandfather. Mark walked up beside her. "They won't cover this up again," he said. She exhaled. "Thank you." Mark nodded. He had spent years enforcing laws, but for the first time in his life, he was fighting for justice, and it felt right.